All right, hi, Senior Master Sergeant Jackson here, South Carolina Wing. This is our CDI class for this month of August, Humility. And we're going to use one of our great American heroes, Abraham Lincoln, probably very iconic when it comes to humility, as a discussion point. And in particular, we're going to talk about his Gettysburg Address. For those that do not know about the Gettysburg Address, essentially Lincoln had commemorated the graveyard at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, after the Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought in July of 1863. To give you some context to that, though, when you look at Gettysburg, which is only 3 days of fighting, anywhere from 50 to 60,000 Americans died in 3 days of fighting. Look at Vietnam, right? That war lasted approximately 20 years, and again, same amount of Americans died in that, 50 to 60,000. So that gives you some context. Without further ado, I'm going to present this movie to you.
In July 1863, during the height of the Civil War, the North and South clashed near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in one of the most horrific battles of the war. When the smoke cleared after 3 days of intense fighting, the fields around Gettysburg were strewn with the bodies of over 50,000 wounded, dead, and dying, and hasty graves were dug on the battlefield to bury the dead. Later that year, a committee supported by the governor of Pennsylvania created a soldiers' cemetery for the Union troops who died in the fighting at Gettysburg, and those bodies were relocated to the new cemetery. On November 19, 1863, a dedication ceremony for the cemetery was held that included a 2-hour speech by Edward Everett praising the Union and showing off Everett's eloquence. Then, near the end of the ceremony, almost as an afterthought, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, rose and gave a brief 2-minute dedication that has become known as one of the greatest speeches of all time, the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln was one of the finest leaders our country has ever known, yet his remarks that day provide a glowing example of Lincoln's genuine humility as a person and a leader. Listen to Lincoln's words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Let's take a moment to consider how Lincoln's remarks show his humility. First, did you notice that Lincoln never mentions himself, never mentions that he's president, and even downplays his own importance? He says, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." Instead, he emphasizes the work of others. The world can never forget what they did here. He even points out that he cannot accomplish what the fallen have already accomplished. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. Like all humble people, Lincoln didn't think too much of himself, his abilities, his office, or his accomplishments. Second, the entire address is an expression of gratitude. It's an attempt to thank and honor the brave soldiers who gave the last full measure of devotion. Humble people honor the efforts of others and thank them for their sacrifices rather than claiming glory for themselves. Third, Lincoln doesn't emphasize the differences between the Union and Confederacy. This speech unifies rather than divides and leaves no room for us versus them. He doesn't mention that his side won the battle. There's no gloating, no chest thumping. Lincoln doesn't even presume that his side is going to win the war, even though the Confederates had lost 1/3 of their forces and Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia. Instead, Lincoln admits that we are still engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Because it's a civil war, it's our war, which means it's our fault and not just their fault. Lincoln accepts his share of the responsibility and draws the nation together. Humble people own up to their responsibilities instead of blaming others. Fourth, Lincoln commits himself to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Lincoln doesn't pawn this off as someone else's responsibility. Instead, it is for us the living, in which he includes himself, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work. Humble people are willing to take on difficult and challenging tasks. Finally, note the order of importance Lincoln implies. The living are less important than the dead, who are less important than the nation, which is less important than liberty and equality under God. Humble people have their priorities in order and know whom and what they serve. Almost no one remembers what Edward Everett said that day in his 2-hour-long speech, but the world remembers what Lincoln said. Abraham Lincoln was one of the greatest leaders our nation has ever known because of his ability to lead with humility. Genuine humility is not a weakness. It is one of the defining traits of a truly great leader.
So now we know why our Gettysburg Address has survived the test of time. All right, our CDI class this month, as I explained earlier, is humility. I'm your instructor, Senior Master Sergeant Jackson. I also happen to be the South Carolina Wing Command NCO. Our references are CAP Regulation 1-1, which is Ethics Policies, and CAP Pamphlet 50-2, which basically is our core values. Length of the class will be approximately 45 minutes, and there's going to be 2 assignments. The first one is going to be a quiz, 16 questions. You have to get a 70%, and there'll be some essay questions as well as multiple choice. And you're going to do a thank you exercise at the end of this, or more of a thank you email at the end of this. Okay, so it's easier to pick out people with humility than it is to try to explain humility, right? And you'll find this is one of your essay questions on your quiz. Essentially, I'm going to want you to pick out a person in your life that shows humility. And then give me 3 reasons why you believe that they show humility, okay? Okay, a lot of times we actually can define something based off what it is not. Here's an interesting exercise that'll teach you a lesson. Basically, what is the opposite of arrogance? And a lot of people would say that's humility. Now, let's define arrogance, right? Arrogance is basically when you believe you're the most important person and everybody else around you is not as good as you, right? The opposite of that would not be humility, it would be submissiveness, right? Somebody who's submissive believes that everybody else is important, but they are not, okay? So the furthest extreme from arrogance is not humility, it's submissiveness, okay? Humility actually is halfway between submission and halfway between arrogance. Somebody who's humble is not only going to respect other people, but they're going to also make sure that they're respected as well. All right, how can humble people be assertive enough to be effective leaders? Before we get into the weeds or details on that one, we need to know 2 definitions. The first one is aggression. Aggression is not humility, okay? Aggression is a poor leadership style. And let's talk about what that is or define it. It's a way of communicating where you try to control the behavior of others through threats, anger, and or manipulation. Very negative, and certainly a humble person would not do things this way. I noticed that a lot of young, insecure cadet officers have a tendency of using this leadership style or approach. Assertion, and this is exactly what every Civil Air Patrol leader should do, or the verb of how they should lead. And this is basically having clear, direct communication while respecting yourself and others. Of course, the theme of yourself is part of humility, respecting yourself, I keep on hitting on. And this is a good visual picture of where that's at. Okay, so to the left, the yellow circle, that's an aggressive person, which it's all about their needs. To the right, the blue circle is a passive person, and it's going to be about everybody else's but their own needs, okay? They're kind of a doormat. But right in the center of those two camps is assertion, okay? You need to be bold and strong enough, but not too bold and strong. Okay, how does practicing the virtues of humility allow you to embody CAP's core values? Easy. Integrity number one, integrity first, right? All integrity is following the rules, whether they're moral or organizational rules, but following them even when nobody's watching, right? Somebody with integrity, somebody with humility is going to have the chutzpah or the willingness to adhere or put themselves under the control of organizational or moral rules. As far as volunteers go, that's somebody who's willing to give their time openly without expecting anything back. Now, people that just do for themselves, or if they do you a favor, demand that they're going to be paid back, certainly don't have a volunteer's heart. A volunteer openly gives his time to other people to help and assist, and that, of course, requires humility. Respect. How can you respect anybody else unless you have the humility to understand where they're at and who they are and to meet them where they're at, okay? And likewise, make sure that people respect you for who you are as well. Excellence. All excellence is overachieving, right? Getting above the standard. It's not perfection. I will say this, though, with excellence. Anybody who commits to excellence is actually putting in the extra groundwork to be more successful than the next person. If I had two cadets with the same aptitude, and one's passing their testing and the other one isn't, the one that's passing their testing has the humility to adhere to studying, practicing, and making sure that they can actually pass the test, and thus equaling excellence. Okay, this is another essay question for your quiz. How can you recognize someone who lacks humility? What behaviors do you see in such people, right? So begs the question, how can someone be both confident and humble at the same time, right? Well, there's a few options here, and this may be an essay question for you, but I'll rattle off a few. They can boldly let others be first. They can stand up for themselves, which you should be doing, which also can be defined as self-advocating. They can volunteer for the harder tasks or hard tasks. They can be a servant leader. They can return messages properly, and when they are late, they apologize. So there is a way that you can both be confident and humble at the same time. All right, let's talk about what are some negative consequences of having a poor self-image. Well, first, you need to know if you do have a poor self-image or not. There is a test, okay? Do you perform negative self-talk? What is negative self-talk? Well, negative self-talk is basically, best way I can explain it, let's say that you had to show up at a meeting tonight and there's a very, very important document you need to bring with you and you neglect to bring it with you. And what do? You roll your eyes, you beat yourself up and go, man, I'm so dumb. How did I forget that? Why do I do these stupid things all the time? That's negative self-talk. And 70% of Americans actually participate in that. It's very bad for you because why? It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. What does that mean? It pretty much is stripping your confidence so you can actually accomplish anything. Likewise, it leads to depression. It can lead to worse things than that, okay? So if you engage, and most Americans do, in negative self-talk, there are ways to actually recondition yourself. For example, next time you make an honest mistake, of course, you're going to impulsively say, man, I screwed this up. Give a pause and then apologize and accept your own apology. I know that sounds pretty goofy, right? But remember, If people make honest mistakes around us, we're supposed to forgive them, aren't we? So we should forgive ourselves as well, shouldn't we? Yes. How can you recognize a humble senior member? What behavior do you see in them? Okay, CNC stands for Customs and Courtesies. Customs and Courtesies, as you know, is saluting, marching, the basic polite gestures, military gestures we do in Civil Air Patrol. Some senior members do not like doing them. And in those cases, it's mostly over a lack of humility. I'll give you a good one. Some senior members just feel awkward doing them. They don't like doing them. They feel like they're distractors. They don't want to be subservient to the policies and regulations of our organization. Others don't feel worthy enough. They don't like being saluted. They don't like rooms called to attention. Now remember, we're not doing this to feed egos. We're doing this to condition and train ourselves and cadets to exist in a military environment. So in either case, it's a lack of humility. Tardiness. Humble people are usually never tardy, okay? If they are tardy, they usually show up and apologize to everybody that they made late or that they were late to. Likewise, they usually call ahead to say that they're going to be late. Another thing is, if you're in charge of training and late, that's bad time management, okay? That means that you're being disrespectful to other people's time and you don't possess humility. Cadets. A humble senior member has no problem working with cadets. Now, I know that all seniors enjoy working with cadets. I got that. But there are other things we can do to support the program, right? For example, driving a van to escort cadets to encampment, O flights, and there are all kinds of other activities you can do. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to work directly with the cadets, train and teach them. And a job, okay? Okay, we all have jobs, but I'm saying a job with CAP. If you belong to a Civil Air Patrol unit, what is your responsibility there? Do you perform a leadership function? Are you fulfilling a staff function? Or you're just there for yourself, okay? The first two are the right answers. Okay, now let's do the flip side. How can you recognize humble cadets? What behavior shows you that a cadet is humble? Again, customs and courtesies. They have the humility to learn the attention to detail and the exactness of military customs and courtesies. Testing and training. They take training seriously, meaning they're not clowns, they're paying attention, they're taking notes, they're not goofing off, right? Cadets who do those things, goofing off and are not committed to training, do not possess humility. Testing. If you have humility, you're going to study on your own the way you should, and you're going to pass your tests, okay? Granted, there are cases where people are bad test takers, but in truth, if that is you, then you should be seeking somebody out to help you. And that requires humility sometimes to get outside of ourselves and look for help. Leading to the next one is wingman, kind of the same situation. A humble cadet is going to contact or communicate with the wingman to make sure that they're up to speed and see if they need help with anything. Likewise, a humble cadet that needs assistance is not going to be afraid to reach out to his wingman to get that assistance. And then respect subordinates, okay? We know subordinates have to respect leaders. That's just part of our environment. But the part that a lot of people get wrong is leaders respecting subordinates. You can't treat your subordinates badly. And if you do, or you're abusive to them, then you don't possess the humility you should have as a leader. Now here's a great quote when I talk to cadets about teaching with humility. And this is from, of course, General Mattis. Everyone needs a coach, but nobody needs a tyrant. And these are definitely words to live by, especially in our organization. All right, could humility of our members ever negatively affect the squadron? If so, how? What should we do about that? Okay, so basically, how can humility be actually a problem, right? And that's going to be an essay question, so get creative, all right? Think about how humility can actually, if you do it to the extreme, can set you back. Okay, your assignments. You have a test, 16 questions. You need to get 70% on that. They're both multiple choice and essay questions, all right? And before or after that, but within at least the next 24 hours, you need to send an email through Outlook to another Civil Air Patrol member, preferably somebody that you find that's humble and that is deserving of a thank you. Like I sent this particular one out to Colonel Stanley because I sincerely am thankful for his commitment to our encampments. Again, you have 24 hours. Make sure you have your squadron commander in the BCC line of that so you can get credit for this. Great quote. Humility is not thinking of, excuse me, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Great man, C.S. Lewis. All right, questions. You'll have to email any questions because this is a video recorded class.